Hello, and welcome to Arts Alive Books. My name is Jerry Smith, and joining me tonight is local author Tony Schumacher, who's going to be talking about his debut novel, The Darkest Hour. Before we get on to the book, Tony, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into writing?
Oh God, my background is, I think it's these white boards, isn't it? I'm not too sure. No, my background, it's long and it's varied, and it's mostly awful, to be honest with you, Jerry. Terrible failure at school. Stumbled through about 25 jobs, 30 jobs. And then eventually, at some point, working in the Caribbean, selling underwear and driving cabs and working in bars and being a bouncer and stuff like that. And then eventually I ended up being a copper for about 10 years. And then because I thought, you know what, my life is too simple, I quit that and became a cab driver for 4 years. And during those 4 years, through a series of accidents, I started writing.
Okay.
For the first time in 30 odd years. I'd not written anything since I'd left school.
And what kind of stuff were you writing?
I was writing a column for a magazine, Liverpool Confidential, and Manchester Confidential, which is like an online, regular, ongoing kind of magazine. It's a great format and a great kind of platform for writers to come through, new writers to come through. And I was driving a cab one night, and the editor of the magazine, the Liverpool version, Angie Salmons, got in the back of the cab, and I said to her, "What do you do for a living?" And she said, I edit a magazine. And I just said, I don't know why I said it even out to this day. I just said, I do a bit of writing. And the last thing I'd written was a note for the milkman about 20 years ago. I'd done nothing, you know. And she said, well, what do you write about? And I said, well, I write about things that happen in the cab. You know, like little stories, little conversations that take place in the cab. And she said, oh, that's really interesting. Send me some of your stuff. And I had nothing. I'd written nothing. I just made it all up, you know. So I went home that night and I literally wrote the first thing I'd written since I failed my O-level at school, my English O-level. And that was, it became, from that first column, I suppose you call it, from that first column came a series of these like little features that we call Rear View Mirror, that were like, would they be in once every month or something like that?
And eventually that led to a publication.
Yeah, it was only a self-published thing. It was people were asking me, you know, can you compile them into a book? All these little stories and stuff, and can you, squeeze them all into a book? And so I thought, well, it'd be a good exercise in editing and learning really about what I'm doing, what I'm doing now. At that point, I wasn't doing it. But it'd be a good exercise to squeeze it all into a book and just see how that works, the editing process and everything else.
So you obviously got the bug, and then you felt there was a novel in you?
Yeah, I didn't really. I got the bug in that I love it. Oh God, I'm so lucky, and I'm conscious of the fact that I'm so lucky to do what I do for a living. But I didn't necessarily get the bug and think I had a novel in me. I'm looking at that one there that you're holding now, and even now I still find it difficult that was actually in me. Not that actual physical book, obviously, but the story it contains was actually in me, because it's that kind of weird thing. The story, how that came to be, was I'd been driving the taxi and I got home at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd had a miserable night. Any cab drivers who are watching will know that feeling of just trawling around the city and not being able to make any money, and it's just awful. You just have these weird nights where nothing goes right, and I'd done that all night. And I'd given up at about 4:45, 3/4 to 4. And I bought one of those dodgy chicken sandwiches that you get, from the garage. And I went home and I'd left the TV on for the dog. It's just weird. And I'm sitting feeding the dog the chicken sandwich because I couldn't face eating it. And on the screen, there was a documentary finishing. And the credits were rolling on this documentary. There was a photograph on the screen of an English bobby. And like I say, I'd been a policeman for 10 years. I'd been that bobby, I'd done that job. And this English bobby on the screen, on the photograph, was holding the door open for a German officer in the occupied Channel Islands during the Second World War. And that, unwittingly, I didn't realise, but that was the moment that happened, that book started, that was like the Big Bang kind of thing when it happened. But even then, it didn't occur to me that it was going to be a book. It wasn't that thing where I suddenly went, God, there's a book in that, I'm going to write a book about it. It was a thing that I was angry with the guy. I was angry with the copper because I thought he'd let us down. I thought as a policeman he'd let me down. That uniform and helmet and all that kind of stuff. I thought, God, look what you're working for the Germans.
So once you started, you got the idea. Did you have to do a lot of research to?
Thank God for YouTube, you know. No, it's not. A lot of research, just ploughing through books, ploughing through stuff. Fascinating, you know, really fascinating, but also incredibly depressing because you realise just how awful. You know, we have this thing in our head, you know, of like, you know, a war film, you know, where Eagles there with Clint Eastwood giving it one of them. It's so bleak. It's so
Perhaps
depressing.
we should explain at this point, the novel's set in 1946, and it's set in a London which is occupied by a victorious Nazi regime who've won the Second World War.
That's right, yeah. And it's basically what would have happened. It's not a big geopolitical kind of novel. It's about the people who are inflicted with that, you know, with that kind of government above them. It's about them, really. And, you know, ideally I would have set it in Paris, but I couldn't afford to go to Paris and do the research, you know, so it was easier for me to transpose it to the UK and basically surrender England.
I suppose it's more interesting the fact that it's set in London rather than Paris. I mean, France has a very traumatic history and a very traumatic relationship with the Second World War and the whole history of the Vichy regime and so on. Something which Britain never really had to face up to for whatever reason. Although many people, and there's a whole kind of genre of counterfactual fiction about this very scenario that you describe so brilliantly here.
It fascinates us really, doesn't it? I did an interview, funny enough, last night. I was up late last night doing an interview. Sorry, it's the bags under my eyes as well. Doing an interview about it. And a guy said to me, what is the fascination that we seem to have? Where does that come from, that fascination about the counterfactual kind of thing? And it's crazy because I can't understand why it does fascinate us so much. I like to think it might be because we have this thing where we kind of look towards, not all of us, but many people look towards Europe and say, we wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't have been like that. We wouldn't have, you know, surrendered to them and allowed them to treat us in such a way. And part of the book is Rossett, the lead character of the book, he's found himself rounding up Jews. He's doing the worst job possibly, you know, in history. He's rounding up Jews and he's sending them away to die. And it's that thing about, I wanted to explore that thing about, could we have done it? Could we have done that? Could we have been that guy? You know, to stay alive and to exist, what are you prepared to do? And that was that kind of thing. But it was interesting, you were talking about France. One of the things that I read an account by a French copper who was in Paris during the war. And he was an inspector in the Sûreté. And one of the things that he said was he didn't really notice a real difference in his life during the occupation. He said, oh, yeah, sure. He said, you know, I might go to a bar of an evening or go to a cafe. He said, and there'd be German soldiers wearing uniforms. He said, but on the whole greater scheme of things, in Paris itself, food was a little bit hard to come by. Occasionally there were problems with power. But other than that, there wasn't really a great deal going on.
So it ends here, or is there anything else going to
There's
happen?
a second book on its way, which is finished. Potentially a third one, we'll wait and see. Me and HarperCollins and I'm wrestling over that even though as we speak. But there's a second book on the way next year, and then who knows? You just don't know, you know.
And plans after that?
I'll probably be driving a cab in 5 years. We'll see. No, I don't know. You know, I've landed my dream job, you know. And so you just want to keep going with that dream job, really, and that's all I'm hoping for at the moment.
Yeah. Tony Schumacher, thanks for joining us and telling us about your debut novel, The Darkest Hour. And Tony will be joining us again in part 2 when he'll be talking about one of his favourite books, the extraordinary My Dark Places by James Ellroy. Welcome back. Kevin McCann describes himself as a consulting poet whose work provides a perfect introduction to poetry for children. We spoke to him recently in his home about his work and his interests.
I describe myself as a consultant poet, and what that means basically is that I'm available to be consulted on any projects involving poetry. So in the past I've worked on editing anthologies. I can help edit individual collections of poems. I can visit writers groups who were interested in writing poetry. I can go to readers groups who were interested in finding out more about poetry. The last few years, the most recent projects, there was one I was involved in a few years ago now, and it was a woman whose husband was suffering sadly from Alzheimer's disease, and what she was doing was she was writing poetry, and she wanted to put together an anthology, a collection of her poems to sell to raise money for the Alzheimer's Society. And she needed a professional writer to help her to edit the thing. In other words, to put together the best poems in the best possible order, make suggestions for improvements and so on. So I worked on that. I've also, I've gone into, I've lost count of how many schools I've visited over the years, but for a long time I used to do a thing called the After School Poetry Club, which was a thing that was mainly junior schools, where you would have a poetry club that would start at the end of the school day. So if the school finished at 3, the poetry club would run, say, from 3:15 to 4:15. And I was involved with, I don't know how many of those in the Knowsley area. It must have been about 20 or 30 of those. The most recent approach I've had, actually, and it's an ongoing thing, it hasn't really got started yet. It's a group of students at John Moores University who are all doing the creative writing MA. They have an idea for a poetry project. I don't want to say too much more about it yet, but it's going to be a public poetry project, and they've invited me to get involved in that as well as an advisor. And basically, you know, the main aim of a consulting poet is it's somebody who, as well as writing poetry, is also available to help other people who want to write their own poetry, publish magazines, publish anthologies, set up poetry projects. And if there's anybody out there looking for a poet for that project, then I'm definitely your man. I mean, I've written poetry for adults, but I've been writing poetry since I was about 8. So we're going back 52 years now, so it's quite a long time. Now, over the years, I made the classic mistake I think a lot of people who write poetry make, in that I thought that there was poetry for adults and that there was poetry for children. Now, when I first started writing poetry for children, which, to be honest with you, was a complete fluke, I got approached by a publisher because I was a member of the Poetry Society, and this publisher wanted to do a new anthology of poems for children. And they wanted to use new poems, so they sent a standard letter out to every member of the Poetry Society, and I got one. I submitted a few poems and I got 2 accepted, and from there started writing more poems for children. I started going into schools, and to begin with I was again making the classic mistake, because I thought if it's for children, as long as it rhymes and as long as it's vaguely amusing or it's funny or wacky in some way, that'll do, because they're only children. I discovered very early on, mainly because a lot of 8 and 9-year-olds weren't at all shy about telling me that children won't stand for that. That children, just like adults, know when they're being patronised, and they know when they're being offered something that was second rate. And I began to come to the conclusion after a number of years that the only difference between poems for children and poems for adults is the vocabulary and the subject matter. And I remembered a dictum that Oscar Wilde, who is one of my great literary heroes, came out with. And he said, it's either well written or it's badly written. I write whatever comes to me, to be honest with you. I write serious poems for children. I write humorous poems for children. I mean, I'll give you an example if you like. In the playground corner, I stand and see girls with skipping ropes, boys with footballs, and everyone shouts at once. In the playground corner, I stand and see a teacher looking at his watch, cup of coffee in one hand and a whistle in the other. In the playground corner, I stand and see big kids sharing jokes and sweets, and one skits our headmaster, and everyone knows everyone else. In the playground corner, I stand on my own and wish I could just go home. I think the one thing that poetry really can do is that it gives people it puts them back in touch with themselves, and I think that's terribly important.
Tony Schumacher joins us again to talk about one of his favourite books, My Dark Places, by the Los Angeles writer James Ellroy. So, Tony, tell us a little bit about this book and why you chose it.
Why did I choose it? I bought it years ago. I picked it up at a library years ago on one of those shelves, you know, where books are for sale for like 25 pence or something like that. And the cover, to be honest with you, kind of sold it to me. I'd read LA Confidential, but there's something about the cover which is so old-fashioned and you know, it's cut off and a picture on the back, you know, it looks great, you know, that whole thing. And I'm a big believer in that, you know, if a book looks good, go with it and see what it's like, see if it's any good. And when I read it, and I've read it so many times, as I'm looking at it, I'm a little bit embarrassed to see like there's coffee rings on the top of the cover. It's got such a style, and I read once somebody said about James Ellroy that when he writes, it's like he's punching you in the chest. It's like every word just hits you, bang, 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 and he's got that real pugnacious kind of raw style of writing. And I'd advise anyone who wants to learn how to write, anyone who wants to make a career out of it, or even just write for a hobby, read anything by James Ellroy, because he cuts away every bit of bone, and there's a real honesty in what he does. And when I say honesty, My Dark Places is about the murder of his own mother and his own investigation into the murder of his mum. And you can't get anything more brutal or honest than actually writing about the murder of a parent, your own parent. And when you read the book, I can remember the first time I read it, and it's still genuinely shocking now. Even now, I literally lost count of the times I've opened the book. Within 3 pages, there's a photo of his dead mother lying at the side of a road that he's put in there. I mean, you can't, you know, people say to you as a writer, try and be honest. Try and be honest when you write, and try and write what you feel and get your own emotions on the page. You can't get anything more viscerally honest than sticking a photo of your mother's, you know, battered and abused and broken body on the front page of a book and giving it to someone and saying, read that, that's me, that's my life.
So in some senses, the theme of the book is mirrored or is replicated in his style. He found a style which enabled him to access those levels of visceral truth that you've described.
You kind of wonder with it, because his emotions are so... I mean, he's had a hard life, Ellroy. I mean, you think I've had a colourful past. You know, he's had an incredibly colourful past. He's spent time in prison. He's, you know, was involved in drugs, burglary. You know, he's had a terrible time, and he's come up through that, and he's pushed through, and he is the writer he is today. But it's the sheer... The way he writes, you can almost see that he's still got his guard up. It's almost as if, you know, and that his emotions are there and that they're spilled on the page, but they're in such short, choppy little sentences. I doubt there's a book with as fewer commas or semicolons as there is in that, because each one is a sentence. And there's times when you're reading it, you can almost imagine him fighting back tears at times. That he's keep it short. You know that thing when you're upset? I used to say at the police where people are upset, and what they'll do is that they'll keep things short and sweet, bang, 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 that when you're writing the statements of them. Very, very short and sweet, and it reminds me a lot of that.
You mentioned LA Confidential, which I suppose most people will know through the film. Is there something kind of particularly filmic about his writing, do you think, that lends itself to filmic treatment?
I think so, definitely. I think with the likes of that American trilogy, that he's we share the same agents as well. And I've had this conversation with my agents in the States about it, which isn't why I chose the book, by the way. He doesn't need my help, but he does. Apparently, he talks. He's very cinematic in the way he is. He comes across as a tough guy. Well, he is a tough guy. He's had a hard life, you know. But he comes across as this kind of tough guy. He's almost like a character from a film. And it's almost as if that he is a film. He is almost a fictional, hard-boiled, tough crime writer. That you would see in one of these 50s noir books. You've only got to look at the way the guy dresses. You know, it would be impossible not to be cinematic in your writing if you looked like that. Do you know what I mean? It's incredible what he does.
I saw him being interviewed on a number of the extras for the LA Confidential film. He is a very compelling character.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Nat, my agent said that he's known him for like 30 years, 40 years. And he said even now when he meets him, he said if they go out for a meal or if they sit in a bar maybe and have a drink afterwards, he said, I'm still intimidated by him 30, 40 years later because he's not, although he's not a violent guy, you know, he was, but he's not now. Yeah. It's just he lacks any light and shade. He's just light. That's it. There's no sort of rough edges.
Tony Schumacher, thanks very much.
Pleasure.
And thank you. And join us again very soon for another edition of Arts Alive Books.